He went to the doctor expecting answers and left with an expiration date. But when his wife confessed she was pregnant by another man before he could reveal his diagnosis, his final days became a choice between vengeance, forgiveness, and the kind of peace that comes only after ruin. When the doctor finally called me back into his office that afternoon, I knew before he said a word that it would not be good news. The air in that small room felt thick and heavy, and the sound of the wall clock ticking behind me grew louder with every second I waited. When he began speaking, I could see his lips moving, but my mind kept drifting away from his words. It was only when he used the phrase stage 4 that everything froze in place. My lungs felt tight, as if the very disease he was describing had already claimed the air from them. I walked out of that building with a stack of papers in one hand and a numbness that ran so deep I could hardly feel my own heartbeat. I spent the drive home staring at the road but not really seeing it. Every red light felt like a small eternity, and every turn I made seemed both too quick and too slow. The world outside my windshield kept going on as if nothing had changed. People carried their groceries, children ran across crosswalks, someone laughed into their phone. It was strange to realize that the world does not pause when your life quietly ends. When I got home, I sat in the car for a while trying to steady my breathing. I remember thinking about how I would tell my wife about this and how I would keep my voice calm so she would not break down. That night I could not eat. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long gone cold and watched the shadows shift across the floor. The papers from the hospital were spread out in front of me like a confession of something I could not undo. I kept thinking about all the things I had not done and all the plans we had never started. The trip we always said we would take, the repairs I kept postponing, the quiet evenings we promised ourselves when work slowed down. Life suddenly felt like a list of things I had run out of time for. For 2 days I said nothing. My wife must have noticed that something was off because she kept asking if I was tired or if work had been stressful. I nodded and smiled and said it was nothing serious, even though inside I was already grieving the life I would not get to finish. I waited for the right moment to tell her, but there is never a right moment for that kind of news. Every morning I woke up thinking maybe tomorrow, and every night I fell asleep telling myself that one more day would make it easier. It never did. On the third night I decided I could not keep it from her any longer. I rehearsed what I would say while standing in the bathroom staring at my reflection. My skin looked pale and thinner than I remembered. I tried to imagine how she would react, how her eyes would fill with tears, how she might reach for my hand in disbelief. I thought about how I would comfort her even though I was the one who needed comfort. When I walked out into the living room, she was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. I sat across from her and told her I needed to talk. Before I could even begin, she started crying. Her hands trembled as she tried to wipe her face, and I felt confusion wash over me. For a moment I wondered if somehow she already knew about my diagnosis, but then she said something that made my stomach twist. She said she knew exactly what I was about to say and she was sorry. I remember sitting there in silence, not understanding what she meant, until she confessed everything in a rush of tears. She told me about the man at her office, about how it had started with late nights and innocent conversations that turned into something else. Then she said she was pregnant. It took a moment for the words to register. Pregnant. The sound of it echoed inside my head and everything around me grew very still. I felt the weight of my own breath pressing against my chest, and for a second I thought I might pass out. I wanted to speak, but no words came out. I just stared at her while she cried and tried to explain herself. My heart, which had already been fractured by the diagnosis, shattered completely. When she finished, I stood up and walked to the window. Outside the night was quiet, the streetlights flickering faintly through the glass. I wanted to scream or cry or do anything that would release the pain swelling inside me, but all I could do was stand there and listen to the sound of my own breathing. In 1 week I had lost both my future and my marriage. And the cruelest part was that I still had not told her about the cancer. That night I lay awake in bed while she slept in the guest room. I could hear her muffled sobs through the wall. My mind kept looping back to the same thought over and over again. I was dying and she was already gone. Tomorrow I would have to decide whether she deserved to know the truth about what was happening to me. But as I stared at the ceiling and felt the slow, heavy rhythm of my heart, I realized that maybe some truths are better left untold. The next morning the sunlight came through the blinds in thin pale lines that cut across the floor like faint reminders that life goes on whether you want it to or not. I woke up before the alarm and sat there on the edge of the bed feeling like I had aged a decade overnight. The air smelled faintly of the lavender detergent my wife always used on the sheets, and for a moment I almost forgot what had happened. Then the memory rushed back and my stomach turned. She was in the guest room now, and the distance between us felt wider than the hallway that separated our doors. I made coffee out of habit, but it tasted bitter no matter how much sugar I added. Every small act of routine felt hollow. The sound of the kettle, the spoon against the mug, the hum of the refrigerator, everything reminded me of a life that was slipping away. I wondered if she would come out and say something, but the house stayed quiet. Around mid-morning I heard the faint creak of her door and then footsteps heading toward the front. She left without a word. I watched her car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street, and the silence that followed was so thick it almost hurt. The truth sat inside me like a weight pressing against my ribs. I had cancer. I had months at best. And yet the thought that haunted me more than dying was that I no longer had her to hold on to during what remained. I kept thinking about all those evenings when she used to fall asleep beside me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. I used to believe that no matter what storms came we would face them together. Now I knew that belief was just another fragile illusion. I tried to keep myself occupied by cleaning the kitchen and folding laundry, even though it felt pointless. Every few minutes my mind wandered back to her confession and the way her voice had cracked when she said she was pregnant. The word kept echoing in my head like a cruel refrain. I wondered if the child would have her eyes, if the man she had chosen instead of me would ever understand what she had given up. The thought of them together made my chest tighten until I had to sit down just to catch my breath. By the afternoon I found myself staring at the stack of medical papers on the dining table again. Each page listed numbers and terms I barely understood, but all of them pointed to the same conclusion. There was no cure. The doctors had offered treatment options, but none that would change the outcome. The best I could do was manage the pain until the inevitable came. I thought about calling my parents to tell them, but the idea of hearing my mother's voice crack on the other end of the line was unbearable. I wasn't ready to break her heart yet. I wasn't ready to say it out loud. That evening my wife returned. She moved quietly through the house, avoiding my eyes. I could hear the sound of hangers scraping against the closet rod as she packed her clothes into a suitcase. The faint rustle of fabric mixed with the distant sound of traffic outside. I sat at the dining table pretending to read a magazine, but my eyes never left the same page. She walked past me once carrying a small box of shoes, and the faint scent of her perfume followed her like a ghost of our old life. She stopped at the doorway for a moment and said she would be staying with her mother for a while. Her voice was soft but detached, like she was reading from a script she had rehearsed many times. I nodded without saying a word. She waited as if expecting me to argue or beg her to stay, but I didn't. When she realized I wasn't going to speak, she turned and walked out. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed through the house. When I finally looked up from the magazine, my eyes landed on our wedding photo on the bookshelf. We were standing under a string of lights in the backyard, smiling in a way that felt almost foreign to me now. I reached for the frame and studied our faces. We looked young, full of plans and promises. It was strange to realize that somewhere between then and now those promises had quietly unraveled without either of us noticing. I placed the photo face down and leaned back in the chair. For the first time since the diagnosis, I felt an odd sense of calm. There was nothing left to fight for except my own dignity. I told myself that she no longer deserved to know about the cancer. She had made her choice and now I had to make mine. I would handle the treatments quietly if I even bothered with them at all. I would tie up loose ends, settle my affairs, and leave this world without burdening her with guilt or pity. That night I sat outside on the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the crickets hum in the distance. The air was cool and the sky above was clear enough that I could see a few faint stars. I thought about the future. I would never see the birthdays, the anniversaries, the gray hairs that would never come. Then I thought about her future and the child that would soon arrive, and how they would go on long after I was gone. I didn't know if that thought was supposed to comfort me or break me. When I finally went back inside, the house felt larger somehow, as if the emptiness had stretched the walls farther apart. I turned off the lights and lay down on the couch instead of our bed. I closed my eyes and promised myself one thing. Whatever time I had left, I would use it to find peace. Not forgiveness, not revenge, not even understanding, just peace. The following days passed in a kind of quiet fog where time lost its sharp edges and everything blended together. I kept to myself, rarely leaving the house except for short walks around the block when the air inside began to feel too heavy. The neighbors would wave and I would wave back, pretending nothing was wrong. I had become good at pretending. I told myself it was better that way. People fear illness almost as much as they fear grief, and I did not want to be a walking reminder of either. Each morning I woke early before the sun climbed high enough to fill the rooms with light. I would sit by the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that I never finished and watch the street wake up. Children waiting for the school bus, dogs tugging at their leashes, the faint rumble of delivery trucks passing by. It all looked so ordinary and yet so unreachable. I used to be part of that rhythm, now I was only an observer watching life move on without me. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking about her and then immediately try to stop. But thoughts have a way of finding the cracks in your resolve. I wondered if she had told him about the pregnancy yet and whether he had reacted with excitement or dread. I pictured her sitting across from him at some quiet cafe holding her coffee the way she always did, with both hands while her eyes searched for reassurance. It hurt to know that she might have found comfort in another man's promises even as mine were still fading in the echo of our vows. I tried to stay busy, but the truth is there is only so much to clean in an empty house. I reorganized drawers and wiped down the same counters more times than I could count. Eventually I began sorting through old boxes in the attic. There were things I had not seen in years: letters, photographs, mementos from trips we had taken together. Each object was a small doorway into a time when I still believed in forever. I found a folded note from her written during our first year of marriage where she had thanked me for making her feel safe. I stared at her handwriting until the words blurred. That paper went into the trash, but the ache stayed behind. By the end of the week I forced myself to go back to the hospital for a consultation about treatment options. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long. Across from me a young couple sat holding hands, the woman's head wrapped in a scarf. They whispered to each other quietly and smiled through their exhaustion. I realized they were probably fighting for more time together while I was sitting there wondering if I should even bother fighting at all. When the nurse called my name, I felt like a child being summoned to the principal's office. The oncologist explained everything in a tone that was both professional and compassionate. There were medications that could slow the progression and therapies that might ease the pain, but nothing that would change the end result. He told me that sometimes quality of life was more important than length of life. I nodded, though my mind was somewhere else. The phrase quality of life repeated in my head long after I left his office. What was the quality of life for a man who had lost both his future and his family in the same week? On the way home I stopped at a small park near the edge of town. It was the same park where my wife and I used to walk our dog before he passed a few years ago. I sat on a bench near the pond watching the ducks glide across the water. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. It was peaceful in that moment, almost enough to make me forget everything. A boy was flying a kite nearby with his father running alongside him, laughing each time the string tightened. I felt an unexpected pang in my chest, not from the illness but from the quiet reminder that I would never have that moment for myself. That night I opened my laptop for the first time in days. Out of habit I clicked on her social media profile. It was still public. The first photo that appeared showed her smiling at a restaurant with a group of co-workers. She looked radiant, carefree, untouched by guilt. The man sitting beside her had his hand resting lightly on the table close to hers. I recognized him instantly. His name was visible in the tagged list beneath the photo. I felt a cold wave rush through me. For reasons I couldn't explain, I clicked on his name and scrolled through his page. There were pictures of him with his wife, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. In one post she was standing in front of a mirror holding her pregnant belly. My breath caught in my throat. I read the caption twice before it sank in. 5 months along. My wife's affair partner had a family of his own and another child on the way. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock on the wall. I tried to imagine the chaos that would unfold if she ever found out about the other woman. I thought about how betrayed she would feel, how lost and broken. Then I realized that I already knew exactly what that felt like. The idea of letting another person go through that kind of pain made my stomach twist. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt a spark of purpose, however small. Maybe I could warn her. Maybe telling her the truth would save her from the same devastation I had endured. It was not revenge, it was something else, a strange kind of compassion born out of shared suffering. Still, I hesitated. I didn't know if it was my place to intervene or if it would only make things worse. As I lay in bed that night, the thought refused to leave me. The man who had destroyed my marriage was about to destroy his own. His wife was living in ignorance, believing in a life that was already fractured beneath her feet. I could stop that. I could tell her. But then again, maybe silence was its own kind of mercy. When I finally closed my eyes, I knew that the choice I made in the coming days would change more than just my own story. It would ripple outward, touching lives that were still whole and unaware. I did not yet know which path I would take, but I could feel the decision waiting for me just beyond tomorrow. The next few mornings came and went like the quiet ticking of a clock you can hear but cannot see. I kept going through the motions of daily life, pretending there was still a purpose to the rhythm. The kettle still boiled, the mail still arrived, the sun still found its way through the same window each day. Yet every moment felt thinner, like the air itself was wearing down. I was alive, but more in the technical sense than the real one. I had stopped hearing from my wife entirely. She had taken most of her clothes and left behind the rest of her life as though it could be folded and stored in boxes. Occasionally I would notice a missing frame from the shelves or a book she used to keep by her side of the bed, and each time I told myself that I should feel angry or betrayed, but all I felt was empty. Anger requires energy, and I no longer had much of that to give. At night the loneliness began to change shape. It no longer felt like simple absence, but something heavier, more deliberate. I would lie awake listening to the faint hum of the streetlights outside and think about the stranger who had stolen my place in her heart. Somewhere across town he was probably sleeping beside his pregnant wife, just as unaware of me as I had once been of him. The thought twisted my stomach until I could barely breathe. I had convinced myself that silence was dignity, but it was starting to feel like cowardice. On the fourth night I opened my laptop again. His social media page was still public. I stared at his photos for a long time, trying to understand what my wife had seen in him. He was ordinary. Clean smile, decent job, nothing remarkable. Yet there he was, the man who had wrecked my marriage and lied to his own family while doing it. I clicked through the photos until I reached one of him and his wife at a baby shower. She was glowing with the kind of joy that only comes from believing in a safe future. I realized then that I could not let that illusion last. It wasn't vengeance. It was something simpler and heavier. I didn't want this woman to wake up one morning and find out the way I had. I wanted to give her a chance to decide her life before someone else decided it for her. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was selfish, but in that moment it felt like the only thing that made sense. I spent the next hour drafting a message. My hands trembled as I typed and erased and retyped. I told her who I was without any trace of bitterness. I explained that I had recently discovered my wife's affair and that her husband was the man involved. I included dates and details that left no room for doubt. I even attached screenshots of their text messages that I had found on our shared tablet months earlier before I had known what they meant. I ended the message with a single line saying that I was sorry to be the one to tell her and that I wished her strength for whatever came next. I didn't send it immediately. I left it in drafts and sat there staring at the screen. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Once I hit send, there would be no taking it back. I got up and walked around the living room, tracing the same path between the couch and the window over and over. The air felt charged like the moment before a storm. After what felt like hours, I sat back down and pressed send. The message disappeared into the digital void. I stared at the screen waiting for some kind of reaction even though I knew it wouldn't come right away. The room was silent except for the faint buzzing of the refrigerator. I closed the laptop and leaned back feeling both lighter and heavier at once. The next morning I woke with a strange sense of clarity. The fear that had haunted me for weeks seemed to have dulled a little. I made breakfast for the first time in days and even managed to eat half of it. But by the afternoon the anxiety returned. I checked my messages every few minutes even though I knew she might not respond at all. I imagined her shock, the disbelief, the denial that would follow. I wondered if she would confront her husband or if she would sit quietly pretending it wasn't true just to keep her world from falling apart. By evening there was still nothing. Then sometime after midnight my phone buzzed on the table. I stared at the screen before picking it up. It was a single message from her that read, "Thank you for telling me." No anger, no disbelief, just quiet acknowledgement. I sat there in the glow of the screen feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. I had done what I thought was right, but the satisfaction I expected never came. The following day everything unraveled. My wife called me in a fury, her voice sharp and unrecognizable. She accused me of ruining her life, of destroying the one good thing she had left. She said her lover's wife had thrown him out and that their affair was now public knowledge. I could almost hear the panic under her rage. She kept saying that I had no right to interfere, that I should have left them alone. I didn't argue. I simply let her speak until the line went quiet. When she finally hung up, I sat in silence. My hands were shaking, but I felt no regret. The truth had been told and the world would rearrange itself around it. There was no undoing it now. That night I went for a long walk through the empty streets. The air was cold enough to sting and the sound of my footsteps echoed faintly against the pavement. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked and a porch light flickered on then off. The world felt both endless and small at the same time. I realized that for the first time in weeks my mind wasn't consumed by fear or anger. There was only stillness. As I reached the corner of my street I stopped and looked up at the sky. It was cloudless and full of stars. I thought about how strange it was that I had spent so much of my life worrying about what came next when all along the universe kept moving without hesitation. In that quiet moment I understood something I hadn't before. The truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the illusion that keeps you trapped. I went home that night feeling lighter, though I knew the storm I had set in motion was still unfolding somewhere beyond my walls. But for the first time since the diagnosis I slept without waking in fear. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. After the chaos of that first phone call from my wife there was nothing but silence. No more messages, no late night shouting, no slammed doors. It was as if the storm had passed and left behind a hollow calm that I did not quite trust. I moved through the house slowly like someone walking across ice, unsure of where it might crack. The absence of her voice, which used to fill every corner, now felt like a strange kind of mercy. I spent most of my time in the living room with the curtains half drawn, watching the light move across the walls. Sometimes I would catch myself counting how many breaths it took before the sunlight reached the far corner. It was a meaningless habit, but it kept my mind from drifting into darker places. Every few hours I checked my phone out of reflex, though I no longer expected anyone to call. The world had grown small and quiet, and in an odd way it suited me. A few evenings later I received a message from an unfamiliar number. For a moment my heart raced, but when I opened it the words were calm, almost formal. It was from the wife of my wife's lover. She thanked me again for reaching out and said that she had confronted her husband. He had confessed to everything. She had already started the process of filing for divorce. She said she was 5 months pregnant and that while the pain was unbearable she was grateful to know the truth before her child was born. Reading her message I felt something shift inside me, a small flicker of peace. At least one person might be spared the long, slow unraveling that had consumed my life. The next morning my wife showed up unannounced. I saw her car pull into the driveway from the kitchen window. My first thought was to pretend I wasn't home, but before I could move she was already knocking at the door. I opened it halfway and she stood there holding a small box, her eyes red and tired. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then she said she wanted to return the wedding ring she had been wearing until recently. I noticed she had lost weight and that her voice had a strange mix of anger and regret. She said everything had fallen apart, that her lover's wife had left him, that his co-workers had found out that he was facing disciplinary action at work. She blamed me for it all. I let her talk. The words poured out of her like water from a cracked vessel. She said she had made a mistake but that she didn't deserve to be humiliated like this. She said she could have forgiven me if I had just stayed quiet. I watched her face as she spoke and realized I felt nothing anymore, not hate, not sadness, not love. Just a quiet detachment. When she finally stopped, I told her calmly that she had chosen her path long before I had chosen mine and that there was nothing left between us to save. Her eyes flickered as if she expected me to break down or beg her to stay, but when I didn't, she turned away. She placed the small box on the porch rail and walked back to her car without another word. When she drove away, I didn't pick up the box right away. I stood there watching the dust settle from the tires and the faint shimmer of sunlight reflecting off the windshield until her car disappeared around the bend. Then I picked up the box and opened it. Inside was the ring and a folded piece of paper. The note was brief, just a few lines about how sorry she was for everything. It felt less like an apology and more like an attempt to close a door quietly after the house had already burned down. I placed the box in a drawer and decided not to read the note again. That night I found myself thinking about her in a different way. Not as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone trapped in her own spiral of bad choices and guilt. I realized that she was probably as lost as I was, only in a different direction. I couldn't bring myself to hate her anymore. Hate was too heavy to carry with so little time left. The next day I had another appointment at the hospital. The doctor talked about possible palliative treatments and pain management. He said I should start thinking about hospice care. His tone was gentle but direct. I listened carefully and then asked him what he would do if he were in my position. He hesitated and said that sometimes the most meaningful days are not the longest ones but the ones that feel lived. I understood what he meant. I didn't want to spend my last months in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. I wanted to be home where the air still smelled faintly of coffee and rain and where the silence at least belonged to me. After the appointment I stopped by a small bakery I used to visit with my wife years ago. The same woman still worked behind the counter, though she didn't recognize me. I bought a loaf of bread and sat at one of the outdoor tables watching people walk by. Life moved around me in simple ways: a man carrying groceries, a child licking a melting ice cream cone, a woman laughing into her phone. It all felt distant yet strangely comforting. I was part of it and apart from it at the same time. When I returned home I wrote my will. It wasn't complicated. The house and savings would go to my parents and my younger sister. I wrote short letters for each of them explaining where to find everything. Then I sat down and wrote a final note addressed to no one in particular. It wasn't a goodbye letter, just a collection of thoughts I wanted to leave behind. I wrote about how easy it is to take time for granted until you realize you are running out of it. I wrote about forgiveness and how it doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes forgiveness is simply letting go of the need to rewrite the past. As night fell I lit a single candle and sat beside it, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. For the first time since the diagnosis I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel broken or angry or abandoned. I just felt still. The kind of stillness that comes when you stop fighting the current and let the water carry you wherever it's going to take you. I started keeping a notebook by the side of my bed. It began as a way to track symptoms like the doctor had suggested, but soon it turned into something else. Each morning I wrote down whatever thoughts had kept me awake during the night. They were not grand reflections or poetic phrases, just fragments of the world as I felt it slipping through my hands. The sound of rain on the roof, the way the morning light hit the wall, the sharp taste of coffee that I could still manage to drink on good days. Writing helped quiet the noise in my head even when the pain made it hard to hold the pen steady. The illness began showing itself more clearly around that time. I would lose my breath halfway up the stairs and wake up with a dull ache in my chest that grew sharper by the week. Sometimes when I stood too quickly the room spun and I had to grab the edge of a table until the world steadied again. The doctor had warned me about fatigue, but I hadn't understood what that really meant until even small movements started to feel like climbing a hill made of glass. Still, I refused to call anyone for help. I told myself that solitude was easier than explaining my condition over and over. One afternoon my mother called just to check in like she often did. I could hear her folding laundry in the background, her voice warm and ordinary, as if nothing in the world could truly go wrong as long as she kept the household rhythm alive. She asked when I was planning to visit next, and I told her work had been hectic, which was the same excuse I had used for months. She told me to take care of myself and that she loved me. When the call ended, I sat there with the phone still in my hand, wondering how I would ever find the words to tell her the truth. Later that week I received an email from my wife's mother. It was brief and full of hesitation, as though she had written it through tears. She said she had heard about my illness from a mutual friend who worked at the hospital and that she was deeply sorry for what her daughter had done to me. She wrote that she and her husband were ashamed and that they hoped I would find peace before the end. I read it 3 times before closing the laptop. It struck me that in the end it was not my wife who reached out, but her mother who carried the guilt for her. 2 days later my wife tried to call again. I watched the screen light up, but I didn't answer. I let it ring until it stopped and then listened to the voicemail she left. Her voice sounded smaller now. She said she had just learned about my cancer and that if she had known she never would have left. She said she wanted to see me to make things right, to take care of me through whatever time was left. As she spoke I could hear the faint hum of remorse in her tone, but underneath it there was something else. It was not love. It was guilt disguised as redemption. I deleted the message without replying. That night I sat outside on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sky darken. The air was cool and filled with the faint scent of rain. I thought about her words and realized that forgiveness had already happened quietly somewhere inside me, but reconciliation never would. Sometimes people mistake forgiveness for an invitation to return, but it isn't that at all. Forgiveness is closing the door gently and walking away without locking it, because you no longer need to guard what's behind it. A few days later I had an appointment with the oncologist again. He confirmed what I already felt in my body. The disease was progressing quickly. He mentioned hospice care again, this time more firmly. I nodded because arguing against the inevitable felt absurd. On the way home I stopped by a park and sat on a bench near the edge of the lake. The water was calm and the wind carried a soft hum through the trees. I remember watching a family have a picnic nearby, and for a brief moment I envied the simple joy of their laughter. It wasn't bitterness, just longing for something I used to know. When I returned home I opened the notebook and began to write my final entries. I wrote about the park and the sound of the water. I wrote about the strangers who had shown me more kindness than my wife ever had. I wrote about how strange it felt to find peace in the middle of so much loss. Each word felt like placing a stone in a river one by one, until the current slowed just enough to see the reflection on the surface. That evening I received a message from the woman I had told the truth to, the wife of my wife's affair partner. She said her baby had been born early but was healthy. She thanked me again for giving her the chance to walk away before everything collapsed. She said she hoped I was finding comfort in small things. Reading her words I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Gratitude. Not for the situation, but for the simple proof that good can come from ruin if you let it. In the weeks that followed I began to see the world differently. The ticking of the clock no longer sounded like a countdown, but a reminder that time itself was a gift. I stopped checking my phone for messages and started opening the curtains in the morning again. The light still found its way into the house whether I deserved it or not. I made peace with that. The nights were still long and often painful, but I found comfort in the rhythm of the small things. The warmth of tea against my palms, the faint crackle of the candle on the table, the cool air drifting through the open window. Each sensation felt sharper, as if life was giving me one last chance to notice everything I had overlooked before. One evening as the sky turned pale orange I whispered a quiet promise to myself. I would tell my family soon. I would not let them find out too late. I owed them the truth the same way I had owed it to that woman across town. The truth can hurt, but silence has a way of hurting longer. The morning I finally told my family was calm and grey, the kind of weather that softens everything it touches. I drove to my parents' house early while the streets were still empty and quiet. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual and I could feel the pulse in my wrists like a quiet drumbeat. I had rehearsed the conversation in my mind for weeks, trying to find words that would make it easier for them to hear, but there are no gentle ways to tell the people who raised you that you are dying. When I walked through the front door, the familiar scent of coffee and old wood wrapped around me. My mother was in the kitchen humming softly while folding towels, and my father was reading the paper by the window. For a moment I almost convinced myself to postpone it one more day, but I knew if I didn't speak now I never would. So I sat them down at the table where we had shared countless dinners and told them the truth. The words came out steady even though my throat burned with every sentence. I told them about the diagnosis, about how long I had known, and about the treatments I had turned down. My mother's hands froze in her lap and my father's eyes filled with something I can only describe as disbelief mixed with heartbreak. They didn't interrupt, they just listened as I explained how I had spent the past few months trying to come to terms with it all. When I finally stopped talking, the silence in the room felt heavier than the news itself. Then my mother stood up and wrapped her arms around me. She didn't cry right away, she just held on as if her grip could somehow keep me anchored to this world a little longer. My father placed his hand on my shoulder and told me he was proud of me for facing it with courage, though his voice trembled when he said it. That moment broke something inside me and mended something else at the same time. I realized I had been carrying this secret not only out of fear but also out of pride, and it felt like a relief to finally lay it down. They insisted I move in with them so they could take care of me, but I told them I wanted to stay in my own home for a while longer. I wanted to wake up in the place that still felt like mine, even if only for a few more weeks. They agreed reluctantly and promised to visit every day. My sister arrived later that evening after my parents called her. She cried the moment she saw me, but then she smiled through her tears and said that we still had time to make new memories. I told her that was exactly what I wanted. The following days were filled with small kindnesses. My mother brought meals I could barely finish, and my father fixed a creaky stair that had bothered me for years. My sister filled the house with laughter as if she were trying to drown out the sadness that lingered in the corners. Even the neighbors began stopping by, leaving flowers or fresh bread on the porch. It amazed me how people can carry so much compassion for someone else's pain without expecting anything in return. One afternoon my wife's mother stopped by unannounced. I considered not answering the door, but something told me to open it. She stood there holding a basket of fruit and her eyes looked older than I remembered. She said she was sorry for intruding and that she didn't expect forgiveness but wanted to say goodbye before it was too late. I told her there was nothing left to forgive and that her kindness meant more than she realized. As she left, she said softly that her daughter regretted everything but was too ashamed to face me. I thanked her and closed the door, knowing that some wounds are better left unopened. The days grew shorter and I could feel my body beginning to slow. The pain medicine dulled the edges but not the awareness of what was coming. I started spending more time outside, wrapped in a blanket on the porch, watching the light change over the rooftops. The world looked clearer than it ever had before, as if my eyes had finally learned how to notice the details that had always been there. The way dusk glows when sunlight catches it. The sound of wind brushing through leaves. The faint hum of life that continues no matter who is listening. One evening my father joined me on the porch with 2 mugs of tea. We sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from gold to blue. He told me that when he was younger he used to fear death because it felt like losing control. But now he believed it was simply returning home after a long day. I thought about that for a while and found comfort in the idea. Maybe that was all this was, a return to something larger, something still and quiet. That night before going to bed I opened my notebook one last time. I wrote a short note to whoever might find it after I was gone. I wrote that life will never be perfect, that people will fail you and sometimes you will fail them too, but kindness has a way of outlasting everything else. I wrote that even in heartbreak there can be peace if you stop trying to rewrite what has already been written. I ended with a simple line that felt right for the moment. It's enough that I lived long enough to understand what matters. When I closed the notebook I felt no fear. Only a soft exhaustion that came not from illness but from acceptance. I turned off the light and lay down listening to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Outside the wind carried the faint scent of rain and somewhere far off a dog barked once then went quiet. The world kept moving and for the first time in a long time I was ready to let it.